There's a river somewhere flows through the lives of everyone. All that's broken on the riverside. Is it a natural state, how it's supposed to be? I think there's something that we just don't see. Good morning and welcome to We Act Radio. You are listening to radio broadcasting from Anacostia, Nacotchtank land, which is known locally as historic Anacostia, Washington, D.C. This is Community Through COVID, and I am your host, Virginia Avniel Spatz. Later in today's broadcast, we'll hear from Coy McKinney of Southwest DC Action and Peter Stebbins with Save McMillan Action Coalition about the importance of racial equity and outdoor communal spaces in development, particularly at this time of pandemic. And shortly, we'll hear from Lee Kamor Haynes of Free the Vaccine regarding the status of worldwide vaccinations and tomorrow's Global Day of Action. But first, we begin with pandemics and economics and history, a brief segment I've begun offering that's meant to give us some additional perspectives on our current pandemic situation. Episode 4, Change Born in the Plague of Cyprian. In the year 249 of the Common Era, a highly contagious, deadly disease began spreading first in Ethiopia and across northern Africa, then into other parts of the Roman Empire. Cyprian, Bishop of Carthage, described the infection and sermonized for his followers. His work on mortality has been much discussed by scholars over the centuries. The fame of his writing led to Cyprian's name being attached to the plague. In a 2015 article, historian Kyle Harper links 4 areas of change to the plague of Cyprian: financial, socio-political, geopolitical, and cultural. Harper describes a series of changes in the Roman Empire's monetary and financial systems. These include inflation, a shift away from a silver-based money system, during which public coinage functioned through public faith in its exchange value rather than the actual value of precious metal content. So this is a very old, the Roman Empire had money down in a way that will sound very familiar. This was followed by erosion of public trust in the monetary system, greater reliance on the value of gold itself in exchange, and failed attempts at currency reform. It's unclear how much of this can be directly attributed to the plague, but Harper writes, the timing of the collapse aligns with our plague, adding not only financial institutions, but the balance sheets of wealthy creditors would have been submerged by the collapse. So we have financial shifts that led to at least one set of socio-political shifts. Meanwhile, the empire faced external enemies and lost some of its power to invasion, which they were less able to fend off due to the plague and related losses. Finally, Harper writes, civic paganism began to lose traction while the Christian community achieved unprecedented expansion. Other writers about this time period attribute the rise of Christianity to specific religious ideals, often relying on Cyprian's writing. Most commonly mentioned are emphasis on charity, especially toward those afflicted by disease, and notions of suffering and afterlife with relevance for the pandemic. Candida Moss, a professor of New Testament and early Christianity, for example, notes that common experiences of death and disposal of bodies at this time influenced early Christian descriptions of hell and the afterlife. She adds, now that hell had become a place on earth, Christians were increasingly eager to avoid it in the afterlife. The epidemic that seemed like the end of the world actually promoted the spread of Christianity. Harper does not discount this kind of influence, but he sees other forces at work as well. It is not that the pandemic sparked a crisis of malaise and disbelief, he writes, but that its effects undermined the stability of a religious culture that was embedded in society. It was the crisis of civic polytheism that opened the space for the construction of new networks of patronage and community. Employing 21st century skills and 1700 years of hindsight give historians like Moss and Harper perspectives on the plague of Cyprian that we cannot have when considering the plague of COVID-19. But we can consider the kinds of change Harper outlines and the meaning making that Moss describes and explore ways in which money and power may be shifting in this pandemic and what that is shaking loose in cultural life. And because we are in the middle of it, we have the opportunity to ask, will any new networks of patronage and community be the result of happenstance alone, or can we intentionally choose what is constructed, have a hand in what is destabilized? I confess again that I'm an amateur in these areas and only hope that these musings contribute to wider perspectives on our conversations around COVID. And with that, I turn to Lee Kamor Haynes, who is campaign manager for Free the Vaccine. She's coming to us from Brussels, and I say welcome and thank you for joining us. I appreciate your patience with my opening remarks. And if you have thoughts about like what, if anything, is being shook loose and how we might use any openings that are coming up to help people that were previously unseen and unheard before the pandemic, let's, I'd love to hear that. But I do want to get right into the Global Day of Action, which is planned for tomorrow, March 11th. For those who aren't following, we are 1 year into this declaration of pandemic. And I was shocked to read from the Free the Vaccine people that only 10 nations out of the whole world account for about half of the vaccines. And as other listeners of this show will know, we've been very much aware that vaccine distribution is not equitable or even in countries that are getting it. So with that, if you want to add to your introduction, and just tell us a little bit about your work with Free the Vaccine.
No, not much to add. Thank you so much for inviting Free the Vaccine to your show and for having me today. Just to comment briefly on the introductory historical portion, all of that was new information to me. And I think that in thinking about some of the, I guess, historical facts that you mentioned there, that there are things, and I think that we talked about, especially at the beginning of the pandemic and when things were first shutting down and we had to sort of really start to look to our neighbors for help and support, that these, old systems of individualism and also consumerism and just everything being kind of centered around money did seem to start breaking down, and like there was a little hope in how we might construct our lives and how we, I guess, maneuver through our society. But a year later, there haven't been the drastic changes that I think, I won't say many of us or all of us, maybe that I dreamy-eyed kind of thought might happen or hoped for at the beginning. But I think that there is a bit of hope, and we're still talking about it. We're still thinking about, after a whole year of in and out of lockdowns, like many of us are still surviving through mutual aid networks and things like that. And so we see the durability of these and the importance in the everyday lives of so many people who end up getting just left behind by the system. And so in thinking about that and the vaccine, I think that that there is the opportunity here for things to be done differently. But as you say, that is the fact that only 10 countries account for over 50% of the vaccines that have been administered. And lots of us are saying, or, kind of using the terminology hoarding the vaccine, that which is, for me, a kind of a characteristic of a consumerist society, or a wealthy society. Is just kind of getting as much as you can and creating this sense of scarcity that, oh no, we got to get our vaccines and get our people vaccinated. And that's what's playing out. So richer, wealthier countries are, accounting for more administration of vaccine doses, but also just how many or how much is being bought up. And so, for example, one of the statistics that I have seen is that, or at least I should say, a Canadian colleague sent an article saying that in Canada, they have pre-purchased about 5 times the number of vaccines or the amount of vaccines they need for their population. And that just seems unnecessary, because a lot of the extra could be going to folks who need them, in countries where, for example, they've gotten no vaccines. For example, I think it was a few weeks ago, but after the US had several million vaccines administered, I think it was Guinea had 5 vaccine doses administered. So there's this huge disparity that does come down to, who can afford things and who isn't able to afford things. And finally, the sense of scarcity that is being sort of manufactured by this race to vaccinate, some groups of people before others.
So I'm sorry, my phone is making noise. Something's always making noise. So this sense of scarcity is, of course, like that's shocking about Canada. And this sense of scarcity and scrambling where people are pitted against one another to try to get these appointments is just, is really quite disturbing. But I also wonder if we should just spend a few minutes talking about the way that Free the Vaccine came to be, and to remind people that the research was already paid for by our public dollars. And, if you want to say a little bit about how the campaign came to exist.
Yeah, for full transparency, I joined the campaign a few months after it started. But I am a longtime advocate and activist in the health and human rights sphere. And so when it comes to access to medicines and making sure that people are able to get things, all from HIV medication through things like a COVID-19 vaccine, there's a lot of research that goes into the process of developing these medicines. And as you said, most of I think almost 90% of medicines, or essential medicines, are funded by, or mostly funded by, the US government. And so those are taxpayer dollars paying for these medicines to be developed and to be available to the public. But then pharmaceutical companies get involved, for example, with the COVID-19 vaccines, even though, for example, the US National Institutes of Health developed the technology, the mRNA technology. The pharmaceutical companies are, in the game, kind of helping out with the production and distribution. And so they somehow managed to they own the patent to the vaccines. And so they get to, sell it back to us. And so they say, this technology, these vaccines are ours. We own the know-how. and to have it, you have to buy it. And so, so there's this, fact that we're paying twice. We paid for the research and development, but then the pharmaceutical companies are asking us to pay again to have it back. And so, yeah, and so Free the Vaccine came about, to make sure, number one, I think that the system has worked this way for so long that the public isn't really aware that, we contributed to developing the COVID-19 vaccines and other treatments for COVID disease. And the fact that, we have to pay again is pretty unfair.
Mm. And the other thing that I think this system that we have that we just kind of take for granted, capitalism is kind of how we think all the time, is that it, from a public health perspective, which I think is, your expertise, so you can tell me, it doesn't help to have a vaccine that only some people get, because we will continue to have the vaccine, the infection rate continuing. And some people might be somewhat protective, but until we get it out there, it's still going to exist and keep mutating. And do you want to speak a little bit to that?
Yeah. I'll say one of the slogans that we have are with the people's vaccine, and that, there should be a people's vaccine and not a profit vaccine. And so there is this notion, you mentioned capitalism, and that, this race for making as much money as you can by any means is kind of the name of the game right now. And it's unfortunate because, there's so much loss of life and suffering because of this disease. But yet people's lives aren't being prioritized. And thinking of the public health perspective when it comes to, the necessity of equitable access of this vaccine within countries and within the US, like you mentioned, the distribution of the vaccine or the availability of the vaccine kind of falling on racial lines, and richer people, white people, have more access than people of color, poorer communities. And that's playing out across the globe. And the Director General of the World Health Organization has said, no one is safe until everyone is safe. And there's this idea of the US, for example, vaccinating our people and making sure we're safe, and then we can help the rest of the world. But by taking that approach, we are actually harming ourselves, because as we only focus on vaccinating, our people, then, as you say, the vaccine can continue to spread and mutate in other countries. And most recently, there is a variant. I don't know the number, so I won't try to say it, but it's from Brazil, a Brazilian variant that's more, yeah, it's
more
scarier.
contagious, maybe.
Yeah, well, it's more contagious, but it also makes people sicker. And so it's a little, public health experts are a little more concerned about this one than with the South African or the UK variant, because, those were more contagious, but it seems like people are, actually getting sicker because of this one. And so, yeah, so as we, continue to hoard vaccines and not make sure that everyone in the world is vaccinated, we, make kind of a fertile ground for the vaccine, or for the virus, to continue to spread and change. And so the vaccines we have now might not be so effective later.
And the other issue that arises when we're trying to talk about widespread vaccination is what people, I guess, call vaccine hesitancy. And there are very good reasons for people in this country, especially for Black people, for Native Americans, to be suspicious of any kind of initiative of the government, and especially things that have to do with their health. So, how does Free the Vaccine work with that issue, and how do you address it?
Yeah, so Free the Vaccine now is working around vaccine hesitancy, or we say to boost confidence, people's confidence in taking the vaccine. And of course, we understand the history, and like you point out, different communities have different reasons for being hesitant. And one of the approaches that we're taking, and that I personally think it's important to understand, number one is the historical injustices of the US government, the medical establishment in the United States, towards people of color in particular. But there's also just lack of awareness, or not so much information out there about the research and development process, because the previous administration kind of had a hand in so many aspects of government and was very untrustworthy, and that makes a lot of people question the safety and what processes were in place. But I think that it's important for people to know that independent scientists were doing the research. The research on coronaviruses had been going on for or over a decade. So this vaccine didn't kind of come out of thin air because the government said we need this to, win the election. And I think that was a concern of mine. And so I've done the research and talked to scientists, and they are very confident in their research, and also the fact that the governments also gave or put money into the production of vaccines so that they would be ready as soon as for example, the FDA, or depending on where you are, the agency that authorizes vaccines, conducted their independent reviews, made sure that the tests and the research studies, there were several tens of thousands of people that were in these studies, made sure that those came out okay, that the data was solid, and that people would be safe from taking this vaccine. And so then, there was the capability for companies to be able to start, producing those vaccines right away in order to get them out to the public quickly. And so that's kind of one aspect, the kind of secret of what goes on in the background when it comes to developing and producing these vaccines.
Yeah, I will confess that it took me a very long time to realize that the 19 there had to do with the year, and that, coronavirus was not its own, like, just had not suddenly appeared out of nowhere, that it is a type of virus that we've had for a long time. I don't know. We could fault the previous administration for my ignorance, or we could just say that, maybe my science education wasn't that great, or I wasn't paying attention, but I'm sure I'm not the only one who has big gaps in what I understand. And it was only very recently that my husband explained to me, who he does follow these things more, that like the two first vaccines are a different delivery system than the Johnson & Johnson, which, had also just gone completely by me, because I'm not in the category to get the first vaccines. The whole system was so messed up. I just kept saying, I'll worry about it later. And then I realized there's all this stuff I don't know. So, I do think for those who are listening, wherever you're listening, go to freethevaccine.org or go to communitythroughcovid.com and follow our links to their website. There's lots of information. Share it with your networks, read up on it yourself, and you'll be much better informed, because obviously not all of us know, and there are legitimate reasons to be worried. And yes. So we have to get good medical advice, and get that vaccine to as many equitably distributed to as many countries and as many communities as we can. And with that in mind, and we are coming to the bottom of our hour already, Tomorrow is a global day of action, and people who are in the US can join some in-person actions. You can also join things around the world, and there's social media things you can do. Tell us about the day of action and what you'd like people to do.
Yes. So I guess I spent a lot of time talking about what's wrong, but not what we need to do to fix it. And the Global Day of Action is to kind of a public outcry at the injustice of this vaccine apartheid, that some people have vaccine, some people don't. And there are actions that governments can take, that pharmaceutical companies can take in order to make sure that everyone has access to the vaccine. And these include sharing. Pharmaceutical companies can share the technology, the information, basically the recipe on how to make vaccines. And also our governments can agree to remove the barriers in place that prevent other countries from making vaccines for their own people. And so tomorrow is the Global Day of Action of the People's Vaccine, making those couple of demands. And there are actions in a few cities in the US. So if you are in Boston, if you're in DC, if you're in New York City, there are actions at, for example, Pfizer headquarters, at pharma lobbying offices to make these demands. And also on social media, as part of an awareness raising action about the inequity and also about the measures that pharmaceutical companies and governments can take. If you go to or I should say, People's Vaccine on Twitter or Facebook, or I should say on Instagram or Facebook, there are tools you can use there to get that message out. And also, if you can go to the White House website and the number on there to contact the White House. I actually don't have it handy, but I should. You can call the White House and make these demands of the Biden administration. And that number is, I do have it, it is 202-456-1414. Call the White House and tell the Biden administration to stop vaccine inequity globally. And all of those actions and the details for the actions are on our website, freethevaccine.org.
Okay, wonderful. And we have maybe 2-3 more minutes if you have anything that you haven't had a chance to tell us about the action, or about using art in activism, or anything you'd like us to know.
Yeah, well, I think that the one thing that I would want to say, I guess it's more personal, but it is that this idea of this kind of manufactured scarcity, like there is the possibility to make more vaccines, to get those vaccines to everyone in the world. Like, yes, it is important for, our own communities to be vaccinated, but that's important for the whole world. And there are ways to make that happen. So we shouldn't only be caught up in what our politicians are saying, because there are bigger ideas out there. And we can take on those bigger ideas in order to, make sure that the world is okay. And so I encourage everyone to, go to our website to read about these options and talk to each other about them, so we can, demand of those people in power who can make these changes to make sure that, we come through this pandemic.
Great. Thank you so much. So you have been listening to Lee Kamor Haynes, campaign manager for Free the Vaccine. She's already given you the website and some of the actions that you should be taking tomorrow. And you can find lots of information there. And on our website, which links to theirs, communitythroughcovid.com. So with that, I'm going to let you get on to your other work. Thank you so much for taking time, especially with this big action tomorrow and everything, taking time to be with us. We Act Radio really appreciates it. And we are going to move on to talking about some other public health issues that have to do with local DC space and economic development. Thank you again so much. This is We Act Radio, Community Through COVID, and you were listening to Lee Kamor Haynes. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Goodbye.
And I am now admitting our next two guests. In our next segment, we will be joined by Coy McKinney and Peter Stebbins, who are each active in different parts of the district. And we're going to be talking about economic development and racial equity and protecting green space, which is an important part of environmentally sound development and also a part of equity. And I see that I think we have both of our guests are on with us now. Again, you are listening to We Act Radio. I'm Virginia Avniel Spatz, and I'll give a little introduction, and you each can add what you if I miss something. But as I understand it, Coy McKinney is active with Southwest DC Action, a group of neighbors seeking more equitable, anti-racist, and environmentally sustainable development. And Peter Stebbins is focusing on another part of the city where he's involved in saving McMillan Park. And he also works with the Lily and Earl Pilgrim Art Foundation. Is there anything that I missed in your introductions? And also, I go by Virginia and I use she. How do you like to be addressed? I'll ask Coy first. Do you want Coy, Mr. McKinney?
Yeah, either way, Coy is straightforward.
Okay, and Mr. Stebbins or Peter?
Peter, please.
Okay, all right. So
he, him. Mm-hmm.
Okay, terrific. So I had originally planned to focus more on affordable housing, which is an issue in both the McMillan Park and the developments that are going on in Southwest, and we should talk about that. But I also was really interested in this idea of where we're putting density and what's happening to the communities that are losing their green space, and whose green space gets protected and whose lower density gets protected. So, and also I do want to mention that we have the Cotton Annex, which is one particular project in Southwest DC, has a zoning hearing scheduled for March 18th. So I want to make sure that we have a little bit of an update on that. So I'll actually start for a minute with Coy to tell us, you can tell us briefly what happened with the ANC the other night and what you recommend going forward.
Yeah, thank you. So the ANC voted in support of the project, which still baffling to me because just the other month, there was a project that was at South Capitol and M Street brought by JBG that initially had zero affordable housing. And so, the Southwest Action, the ANC voted against it 3 times. Councilmember Allen even wrote a letter of opposition. And, we ultimately got a pitiful amount of 3%, but it was more than what was proposed. And so I thought that the ANC, who has been vocal about affordable housing issues in the past, would continue that. And they didn't. And apparently they were satisfied with a $100,000 donation to a nonprofit for the Cotton Annex to be included in the Southwest bids jurisdiction. And bids in general are another tool of gentrification. And that they would follow the comprehensive plan, which says that inclusionary zoning units, affordable units, should be indistinguishable from market rate units. And so those were the stipulations that they wanted for this project. And There was some talk about, maybe it wouldn't pencil if there were more affordable units. Sorry if you hear a baby crying in the background. I have a
It's a
7-month-old.
wonderful sound.
Yeah. And so that argument to me is hard for me to really accept, because this is Douglas development. They're a big time city developer in the city. They have another project in Buzzard Point, which is going to be 453 units, and it's already come online, and there's 0 of those units are affordable. So Douglas is bringing over 1,000 units to our neighborhood, and only 50 are going to be affordable. So, I know ANCs don't have a whole lot of leverage, but they can at least use the leverage of voting down a project to try and wield some more power. And this is, especially in Southwest, the home of urban renewal. Our small area plan said that residents wanted the area to be an exemplary model of equity and inclusion. And all we've seen is gentrification and displacement over the past decade.
Yeah, and for those who aren't familiar with this or weren't listening, and I do like to tell listeners who might not be from DC or not familiar, advisory neighborhood commissions do meet once a month to discuss this kind of issue. They are supposed to be given what our law actually says is great weight. Nobody really knows what that means, and they don't have a lot of power, but they could have stuck up for affordable housing and for other amenities. Douglas Development, which owns huge properties all over town, decided to give $100,000, and they accepted that. That's less than like the cost of one unit. And they said that their spokesperson sat up in the meeting and just kind of said, well, go ahead and vote however you want, but we're going to the zoning commission anyway. And like basically said, we don't care what you say. So it was kind of a funny setup anyway. So before we get sidetracked, if you want to tell people real quick how to go to the zoning commission or what you'd like them to do, then we'll jump over to the McMillan.
Yeah, so Southwest Action is organizing around all the developments in Southwest, and so we have a testimony guide that if you check out our Facebook page, that's facebook.com/SouthwestDCAction, you'll see a link to how to testify, what the main points are. And, if you can't figure that out, then you can email us at swdcaction@gmail.com.
Okay. And I do, I want to make sure that I do mention that I contacted Ward 6 council member Charles Allen to ask him whether he was planning to respond to Southwest DC Action's demands about the comprehensive plan. And the answer I got back was that he looks forward to reviewing recommendations and has already talked with you. No, commitment to anything. So I did tell him I would share what he said, and that's what he said. And as we shift over to talking about McMillan Park, I also want to mention that I asked the deputy mayor for planning and economic development and the Office of Housing and Community Development if they wanted to say anything about how the plans currently in place for McMillan Park support much needed, deeply affordable or family-sized housing. And they had nothing to say about that. So I do want to shift to talking about McMillan Park for a few minutes. And I will say that I learned this week things that I had not known about that park. I moved to the city after it had already been closed off, which was in the late 80s. And so, I've driven by these weird structures that are sand filtration devices. From what I learned from Peter, was originally designed by Frederick Law Olmsted, who did Central Park and Grant Park in Chicago and all these amazing park spaces. And instead we've got this like fenced off piece of dirty grass. And I think I'm beginning to understand more about the history of the place, but I'd like someone who can really speak to it to start telling us a little about what McMillan Park, or what the McMillan sand filtration reservoir was supposed to be in the beginning.
Hi, I'm Peter Stebbins. And I'm a longtime volunteer for Save McMillan, and in the recent years, I've become the volunteer for the Twitter and Facebook education that we do, and also I work for the Lillian Earl M. Pilgrim Art Foundation. And about a year and a half, 2 years ago, we did a community art project, Traffic Box Art DC, that involved using public records to explore the history and connections that Lillian Earl had to Washington. Earl was a Barbadian American artist, and Georgia Avenue is the corridor for Caribbean culture and the carnival, historic carnival in DC. Lily was Lebanese American, and she came to Washington as a kid with her family, who ran storefronts in Mount Pleasant, and we later discovered through public records, Petworth and Parkview. This really ties into what is of note with McMillan Park, and it has to do with community. It has to do with public park access and integrated parks. Lily and Earl are often described as avant-garde artists, and I dare say that Olmsted was an avant-garde artist too, because until 1905, when McMillan Park's sand filtration site above ground, landscaped by Olmsted with tree-lined avenues, was made available, Washington, D.C. did not have a Black park, did not have a park that Black people were able to go to. Our parks weren't segregated, they were exclusive to white people. And from roughly 1905 until the 1940s, during World War II, this area above the sand filtration plant was used by African Americans and an integrated experience. We have historic photos of Madame Avanti walking the park. Her grandson was Thurlow Tibbs of the Evans Tibbs collection, now in the National Gallery of Art as a collection of African American art. We have, to get into legal and deadlines, which I tweet a lot about, I have a terrific page on our SaveMcMillan.org website that we've just compiled and released in honor of longtime community activist and historic preservation, Daniel Wolkoff, Adams Morgan, Stained Glass Adams Morgan Restoration and Repair. It's at savemcmillan.org/Daniel/. And this is a page of McMillan Park files with key information. And I just opened up a couple of pages to talk about. Number one is the page, Save McMillan Park, Posture of the Agency Cases and Legal Appeals. We have 3 pending claims right now. Court of Appeals, Mayor's Agent, Administrative Review, Office of Administrative Hearings, and then finally, Administrative Review, Board of Zoning Adjustment. These are all pending decision. The second case, Administrative Review, Office of Administrative Hearings, the OAH has 45 days to respond to this case. Whether they respond or not, though, we have a plan to file an appeal due to asbestos issues. And you can find a press release about asbestos with expert testimony on our website, savemcmillan.org. The third case, Administrative Review, Board of Zoning. We've got a video link at this web link at savemcmillan.org. On September 9, 2020, the BZA orally ruled to deny our petition, our appeal of the permits rather, but there's still no written order, which is preventing us from appealing the decision. So these cases are being kept alive in court. You know, a lot of times they're perceived and spoken of as though frivolous by our critics. But I just remind everyone, this is not a frivolous court case because it exists in the courts. We had the experience of Donald Trump to wrap our brains around frivolous court cases. I have so much to say.
Well, let's pause there for a minute. And one of the things that I would like to do, since we do have speakers who are from different parts of the city and experiencing the effects of the comprehensive plan and this thing called inclusionary zoning, which actually really doesn't help us with affordable housing. If we could maybe talk a little bit about some things that the efforts have in common, and the fact that the comprehensive plan is up for vote by the DC Council at the end of the month. Is that right? Do I have the timing right? Or it's coming up soon, right?
Yeah, I think Mendelsohn said he's trying to get it by the end of this month. We'll
so for those, again, who might not be from DC or who are from here or who have been here a long time and still don't know really why it matters, I wonder if, Coy, if you could say a little bit about the comprehensive plan and what you think is needed, the changes that you are hoping that the Ward 6 council member and other council members will enact.
Right, yeah. So the comprehensive plan is the city's planning document. It's supposed to guide development in the city. And going against the comprehensive plan is what gives legal challenges their merit, which is why McMillan and the Berry Farms case are so important. But one of the problems is that there's really no accountability. So the zoning commission will talk about, oh, the comprehensive plan, but then they go against it anyway. So one of the parts of the current comprehensive plan is that affordable housing should be pursued as a civic priority. Well, if that was actually true, we wouldn't have been the most intensely gentrified city in the country. And so a lot of the changes that the new comprehensive plan are kind of watering down the language. Instead of shall, it's should. It's making it looser and more open for land use attorneys to interpret in these abstract ways, which I've seen in Southwest. So, I mentioned the Southwest plan saying we want to be more, we want to remain an exemplary model of equity and inclusion. One land use attorney used inclusion to mean gelling with the fabric around you in a more holistic way. I have no idea what that means, but that is not the racial justice that we're looking for. So we want the comprehensive plan to have concrete language that land use attorneys and the zoning commission can't wiggle out of. One thing that I'm a big proponent of are shared equity models. So 2018, the council convened a limited equity cooperative task force. They released a report in 2019 saying that the number of limited equity co-ops should increase by 40%. Yet there's no mention of it in the comprehensive plan. Limited equity co-ops are some of the only remaining affordable housing in the city. Same with the community land trust, the Douglas Community Land Trust. These are known models. There was a study done by Grounded Solution that was released in 2018 that looked at 4,000 units in 20 states over 30 years and found that 99% of those units avoided foreclosure. So there are known models that we should be pursuing and that the comprehensive plan should have in there. The other thing that we're asking for is that a racial equity impact assessment be given to the comprehensive plan to see that the proposed changes won't have a disproportionate effect on Black people like we've seen with the housing gentrification and displacement. So these are just some of the things that we want the comprehensive plan to reflect so that we can actually start to build affordable housing and produce and keep low and moderate income people in the city.
Okay, and I just want to circle back for a moment to highlight just the one thing you've already raised, that Douglas Development itself has added 1,000 new units, or is about to add 1,000 new units to an area that had far less density 10 or 20 years ago, and that most of these new units are on the luxury end and tend to bring in more white people, so that what Southwest had been relatively integrated, and not just racially, but in terms of different kinds of income and different kinds of people. And it's really being hit very hard. And I want to include Peter in the conversation here too. The plans for McMillan are very similarly very low on affordable housing, but they are in line with this thing that actually is legal, this inclusionary zoning, which calls affordable housing something that's 60% of DC's area median income, which is huge. It's more than any people who are struggling could possibly make, because it includes the area is like out to McLean, Virginia. So, we're talking minimum income of $60,000 or $80,000 for some of these things that are called affordable. And I know that Peter is concerned also with our cultural resources and our green space, which is, an issue in Southwest as well, but so prominent in McMillan Park. So, I wonder, I don't know if you have personally been doing any work on the comprehensive plan or the wider zoning issues, but if you have any comments about what you want people to be advocating for.
Well, I'm following and tweeting and retweeting. I was really looking for a rich graphic, and I don't know, am I screen sharing, and will this be a part of it? Because while my fellow activist was talking, I was pointing my camera away from my face and at my screen. I was looking for a good graphic to just sort of hashtag upflum and help people wrap their brains around what it is. And through the resource link on our website I mentioned, I found last May a place where you can look at a map and you can click on an address and see what kind of upflumming is going on. And I've screenshotted and shared on our Twitter and Facebook the square that is the old sand filtration plant. And it's upflumming. It's interesting how it happened. I guess maybe it was a computer programming, but it's two areas. The park will be changed from what it was, Parks, Recreation, and Open Space, abbreviated PROS. It will be added what's called commercial medium density, CMED. And the CMED and the PROS, so the commercial moderate density and the park, are overlapped. So that now when you look at what the park will be, it will be a sliver of green and then about 90% of orange striped commercial moderate density through green striped PROS, Parks, Rec, and Open Spaces. So it's a really good graphic of what will happen when this occurs at this specific address. So I'd love to see the old Cotton Building and what that upflumming map color scheme is, because to me, this is sort of a sophisticated graphic. I had to really look at it to understand it and say, oh, yeah, it's 80% orange, but it's striped with green. And this is a real big loss, especially in this time of pandemic. Coincidentally, this park opened during another airborne pandemic, tuberculosis. And now we're in an airborne pandemic, and this is a neighborhood of homes that have postage stamp yards and tens of acres. Is it 15 acres we're talking about? Acres of parkland. Sadly fenced off first in World War II because of terrorist threats. It was our only method of obtaining pure water. And then coincident with the deeds and covenants advancements in civil rights. In other words, lifting the covenants.
Can you say a little bit about that for people who might not know that history?
In the late 40s, in Washington, D.C., neighborhoods individual properties were restricted by race for covenant and deed, and also including Jews. And there were important cases that reached the Supreme Court that changed this and removed this, and it changed the complexion of the District of Columbia. And there's a terrific historical organization, Prologue BC, rich with resources, and they've been working on this for years.
Okay, we'll make sure that communitythroughcovid.com has links to all of these resources, including the for those who don't know, the FLUME here is Future Land Use Map. FLUME.
Yeah.
It's we are giving ourselves permission to kind of destroy our public resources. I'm sure that's not how the mayor's office would categorize it, but this upfluming, this declaring something that had been a park can be future commercial land is in fact taking a resource away from the public. And we don't have too much longer this morning.
Yeah.
We have to continue.
I want to totally respect the concept. I understand this need for an urban area as complex as ours to do this kind of advanced planning, but we've got to bear in mind, this COVID experience, it might be our 1.0. This isn't, it's really important to take into account this significant experience, this pandemic, into our urban planning as we continue to share this world with our impact.
Yes, and thank you for for bringing up that we do need to have a future land use. We do need to look ahead, and there will be more people, but we also need to look at equity. And as COY and the Southwest DC Action Group have been, repeating and bringing up, one of the reasons that I'm glad that the two of you are on, even though each one of you could have we need to have more conversation about all of this, is that each project, it's like the Cotton Annex, okay, well, it doesn't have any affordable housing, but, and then McMillan Park, well, it's just this land, but, and the but is that we're not looking as a city at what we need to do to protect everybody and to protect our space and to protect to keep us from going further down the displacement pathway that we've allowed ourselves. And I'm going to add a little tiny thing that makes me sound really ignorant, but this is how it is. I don't get out much because of our situation. And recently I was in the car and I was driving through areas of the city that I haven't been in a while, and luxury apartment after luxury apartment in places that were not luxury apartments when I got here 30 years ago. And I realized that while I've been kind of focused and in my house, the developers have not been relaxing. They've been out there building all this stuff. And we do need to weigh in on the comprehensive plan. Those who are concerned about this particular development, the Cotton Annex, or some of the other things that Douglas Development is doing, need to look up the testimony guide from Southwest DC Action. And we need to use the resources that are on savemcmillan.org to learn more about our history and more about other developments in that particular area. But we also need somehow, I think, to do more work jointly. And our mutual aid, some of our mutual aid groups are helping with that. Are there other things that you would recommend? Well, I'm sorry, I talked too long. We are almost at the top of the hour. And so I'm afraid I'm just going to have to thank you both for coming and ask you to come again a future time. You've been listening to Coy McKinney from Southwest DC Action. You've been listening to Peter Stebbins, who is with the Lily and Earl Pilgrim Art Foundation and also Save McMillan Park. And this is Community Through COVID on We Act Radio. And I'm sorry I talked too long and we are just about out of time. So I do hope you both will come back, and thank you so much for coming. And I really appreciate it. And we'll just have to keep the conversations going. So We Act Radio, do something. Peace.